Hello, hello, and welcome to our penultimate edition of Black Girl Magic Book Chat Women's History Month edition. My name is Larissa, and I am the African American Resource Center Coordinator for the Tulsa Library. Each March, in honor of Women's History Month, I read books by and about Black women and girls and share their stories with you. Thus far, and not even on purpose, y'all, but I think I kind of chose books this time around to kind of highlight stories from across spaces, right? Like I didn't want to just choose stories that were kind of similar. I wanted stories to really showcase the different lives that Black women and girls can lead and have led. So our first story was Purple Hibiscus by Chimamanda Ngozi. That was set in Nigeria. Our second was Dances by Nicole Cuffey. That was set in New York. Our third was Birds of Opulence by Crystal Wilkinson, and that was set in Appalachia in Kentucky. And so our book this week was set in Oakland. And it is called Nightcrawling by Leila Mottley. And I really like this cover. Like, it's super simple. At first, you don't know what this is. I don't think, like, when I first picked it up, I didn't realize. But then I was like, oh, that's a girl in her braids. So this is what I read this week. This one was, y'all, a little bit more difficult to read. And not in a way that means that this book wasn't good or that it was poorly written, because it wasn't. It was wonderfully written. It was set in Oakland, like I said, somewhere in the 2010s. And the way that Leila Mottley describes Oakland is incredible. You can picture it. I've never been to California. It's on my list of places I really want to go, but I've never been. But you can picture it. You can picture the Oakland that she's talking about. The potholes in the street, the dirty apartment pool, the hoops with no nets that the children play in. You can envision the dilapidated apartments in contrast to beautiful skyscrapers that, are in the downtown area. And most importantly, you can envision this character. You can envision Kiara, our main character, who is 17. She's got no family except a brother who wants to be a rapper, an incarcerated mother, and an uncle who has completely abandoned the family for rap, fortune, and fame. When we meet Kiara, she has just found out that the rent in the apartment that she and her brother are renting is doubling. She gets a notice on the door that rent is going to be twice as much. Her brother is only a couple of years older than her, maybe 19 or so. They have both dropped out of school because with both parents gone, someone's got to provide. However, her brother Marcus has dreams of rap stardom and refuses to get a job. And there are only so many options for a 17-year-old girl with no high school diploma and no real work experience. So we kind of follow her in the beginning of the book. We follow her through a couple of days where she's kind of begging her brother to find a job, but then also begging the people at restaurants in the neighborhood, at coffee shops, at Walgreens, at CVS's for a job, and no one's offering it to her. So she then, kind of by accident, falls into sex work. And then she sort of realizes that she can make a couple $100 in a short time frame with little effort. At least that's what she tells herself at first about that effort part. And so she sort of runs into someone, or she seeks out someone that she knows to kind of ask, what does it mean to do this kind of work? So she starts to do this kind of work. And before long, the police get involved. She gets caught in some way. And so they tell her that she must attend these sex parties, because if she doesn't, she's going to go to jail. And Kiara, who has nowhere else to turn, feels like she has no other choice. And so this leads us down a road of abuse and trauma at the hands of multiple Oakland police officers. Her only bright spots in life seem to be Trevor, who is her neighbor. He's 9 years old. And she has begun mostly caring for him in a sort of maternal way, since his mom is always somewhere off doing drugs. And so she's sort of taking care of this kid, even though she can barely take care of herself. And then there's also Ale, short for Alejandra, her closest friend. And Alejandra is her parents own a taqueria, and that Kiara sometimes gets food from. And they're friends. They're good friends. There's so much in this book, and it's one of those that you have to experience, because the gist of the story is about a young girl who has to turn to sex work in order to survive. But this book is devastating in that it's not about just that. It's really about the realities of poverty and injustice and racism. This book is loosely based on a sex ring scandal that rocked the Oakland Police Department back in 2015. In 2015, an Oakland police officer committed suicide and left a note detailing his involvement in this sex scandal, this prostitution ring, in which a teenage girl would be tipped off about prostitution busts by officers in exchange for attending these parties in which she was expected to perform sexual acts on them and others. Criminal convictions for these officers did not come, only with some of the officers being suspended or fired. Unfortunately, this is all reflected in this book, and we see so clearly how power corrupts and how systems that we have in place continue to favor those in power. And I think that was what was so hard about this book. Now, mind you, reading about a 17-year-old girl involving herself in this work is hard to read by itself. But then we also realize that regardless of the people who try to save her, it doesn't happen in a way that we want it to happen in. And we kind of really see how these police officers are not held accountable for their actions in this book. In fact, it is all turned around onto Kiara as to, oh, she must have chosen this way of life, despite the fact that nobody else in her life, not her brother, not her uncle, not her mom, because we do meet her mom, not any of these people were there for her. And what else does a 17-year-old do? I think it's easy to judge characters like Kiara and the young lady that she was based off of. But the reality is that she was a child who didn't know what else to do, because no one, not even her uncle, who had the ability, would help her. And I say that while this book did not end the way that I wanted it to, it did end on a note of hope and optimism for Kiara, because it's a reminder that she still has a life ahead of her and that she can hopefully push through despite all those who had failed her. And I think we see that a lot in women. We often, especially with Black people, we get this tag of resilience, right? They're so resilient. But this book showcases what it means to be resilient. And there are also just so many other topics in this book that I could spend so much time on. When I was writing out, I was kind of write out what I want to say to you all. And when I was writing, it was very hard to condense it so that I'm not talking for 30 minutes, because there are so many other things in this book, not just sort of that injustice and not just the effects of poverty and how our actions can be defined by poverty, or how poverty defines our actions, rather. There's so much other things, like Kiara's commitment and responsibility to her family, even at the detriment of herself. Her brother was not my favorite character. And then there's also obviously like these stark power imbalances, often gendered power imbalances, where regardless of what a man or a boy does in a situation, somehow the woman has to suffer the consequences. And we unfortunately see that in this book. Um, and we see a lot of like the lack of autonomy that these girls and these women have in these spaces. It's sad and it's real. But alas, I don't have the time. I really want to shout out Leila Mottley for writing such an important book when she was just a teenager herself. The author of this book, I think, was 17 or 18 herself when she wrote this book. After she lives in Oakland or lived in Oakland, grew up in Oakland, and had heard about this scandal and wanted to bring light to a person who might have found themselves in this situation. Because when we think about situations like this, like I said, it's so easy to cast judgment on characters like Kiera and like the lady, the young girl, lady probably now, that the book was sort of based on, the person who was actually involved in this scandal, right? Like after all these men had been fired or suspended, she was sitting in jail and they had no criminal charges against them. And so it's so easy for, especially women who have no other avenues, who don't have money, who don't have parents, who don't have friends that can help, who are pushed to use lawyers who maybe they care, but they only can do so much. Um, and so Layla Motley at that age was able to recognize this system that we live in and write a beautiful book about it. One that gives our main character grace and love and thoughts and feelings. And I'm not even sure that an adult will have necessarily provided that. It was a book, y'all. And it's one that, while there were parts that I kind of struggled to get through just because of the content, I think there was still some joy in it and some hope in it, with some of these side characters. And so there's optimism in it, even with that trauma, because that's life, right? We get some trauma, but we also get love and joy. And I think that's what makes us resilient. um, what a book. I know that felt like kind of all over the place. I think it did. But I think this was one of those, you got to read it for yourself, right? And I feel like that has been true of all the books I've read this month. There's so much to say. They say so much that I cannot capture in the 13-minute video, which is already longer than any other video I've ever written. I've ever recorded. So next week, for my final book, I am hopping across the pond, as they say, with The Library Thief by Kuchenga Shangje. I have pronounced that wrong. I will fix it by next week. I'm going to make sure that I pronounce that correctly. It is set in England, and not just in England, in Victorian England. So we're going back in the past, a Black woman's story. I'm excited to read it, especially because it's set in a library. The Library Thief is the name of it. So until next week, thank you for checking out Black Girl Magic Book Chat's Women History Month edition. Until next time.